The code is absolutely critical. Certain parts of it are obvious, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but I want to talk about the more non-obvious ones. Okay, we'll talk about the mission and the vision and all those kinds of things that an organization has, which are all very critical pieces of an organization. But the hidden pieces are the ones that are the more troubling, and people ask me about that a lot. How do I actually, going into a situation, identify the code? First of all, think about it from the way I've been talking to you about things anyway, and that is, you've got the frontal lobes of your brain, which is the logical, reasonable, linear parts of your brain. It's the conscious part of your brain. It's the part of your brain, by the way, that also comes up with all the right answers. Yes, I think men and women are all the same. Yes, I think you need to empower your parishioners. Yes, I think you need to grow your kids to a place of responsibility, whatever. Those are all the right answers. The backside of your mind is the place where stories are kept. And in many ways, because it's not mediated consciously, it tends to be much more authentic as to where a person's true values lie. Now, we're starting to get an idea as to how to get a sense of a place's code. You do not want to ask a person about their code. You want them to tell you stories. Tell me a story about First Church. Tell me, and you want the stories in particular places, so you want to shape them. Tell me, and by the way, these stories are going to be wrapped in a lot of myth. So be advised, they're not necessarily, they'll correspond to true things. I'm not saying that, but over time, stories take on a mythic quality. I love American history and I read it a lot, but I also realize that it's like the Civil War, which I've read way too much on in a lot of ways. But it's so encapsulated in myth, it becomes very, very difficult to even understand what happened there, because it's so mythic in a lot of ways. Now we've got people running around reenacting it and all this kind of thing. So to really understand it and to why it was fought and how it was fought and who fought it and all that kind of things becomes very, very mythic. Well, realize that then when people are telling you a story, it's mythic, but the mythic piece is very, very important to code. So you want them to tell you a story about how this church was first founded, okay? And listen carefully to the founding people, and what they were like, and what was the reasons that they brought about this church and all of that. I just listened to it, realizing again that a lot of it's mythic, but you don't need a real story. You need the story that they're going to tell you. And then I want to hear about the heroes in the church. Who were the people that stood out in the years? Like the church I've been at for 41 years, I can tell you names, and I can tell you about them. I do a lot, because some of them really, really stand out to me. But they're mythic, okay? And even the way they stand out to me is mythic. I know that, okay? But it starts giving you, what are the characteristics that made that person a hero? Oh, this guy, man, I tell you, good old John, he'd take on every minister that came in there. I mean, he'd get up in their face, and they're saying it with relish. Okay, now you get an idea of what you're in store for if you're heading into that position, that they love it when people in the church get up in the minister's face. As opposed to them telling you a story about how, my brother was a minister, and he was in about 4 churches in his ministry. He's retired now. But one church, he was taken on, he took on is what he did. The most powerful person in the church was also one of the most powerful men in the community, and my brother lost that. But this guy was also a mythic character, and to take him on was to risk your life, and my brother lost. He went to another church, though, up north of Baltimore, and he was there for 17 years. And the story there, what they told him when he was going in there, they relished the fact that their ministers lasted for years. And that they were really proud of taking care of their ministers. That was their code. So you got one church that's telling you they eat their minister for lunch and isn't that fun, and another church telling you that they relish the fact that they take care of their ministers, and our ministers hang around 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Okay, we got two different codes there, right? So now you're getting a sense, but you will not get a sense of code without story. You've got to have them tell you stories. Now, you do also want to have them tell you stories about conflict. Of course, you can hear that's very important to me. So I would ask them, I'd say, tell me about a significant conflict in the church that's happened over the last 10 years. What was that like? Don't shape your questions too much. Leave them much more open. Do you hear what I said? Tell me about a conflict. What was that like? See, I'm not shaping it. Was it a good one, a bad one? Did it resolve? Did it not? I have no idea. I want to hear what they say, realizing it's wrapped in myth. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of myth there, but that's okay. This is the code that's driving their decision making. So if they say, like, this is a true story, by the way, one of the biggest almost church-splitting conflicts I heard of years ago when I was in my own studies about these things was a church that had a major fight in their church board over whether holiday candy at Christmas should be wrapped or unwrapped. And they went nuts over it. Now, obviously, that was just the pretext for a lot of other stuff going on, but it was an incredible conflict. And so that church would tell you about that. Now, when they start telling you about it, and if it's not clear how the conflict resolved, you want to ask that. Well, tell me, how did that resolve? Or did it resolve? If it didn't, guess what they're handing you? That conflict. That's going to be part of that church's code. And by the way, conflicts can go on for generations. I'm not talking about years, I'm talking generations. You can have generational conflict going on there that's passed on from generation to generation to generation. That's very much a part of that code. So, having them tell you stories. Now, looking at the architecture, like these slides I showed you about the financial institutions. I'm going to show you we're going to have some other slides here about a church in our area. We'll talk about that code of that particular one, which is kind of interesting in certain aspects of it. But one church, not myself, but one of my business partners worked in, he has a slide, I don't have it here, but he has a slide of this church, and on the outside, it is incredibly austere. I mean, it's basically a blank wall. It could be a fort or a penitentiary or something like that. I mean, there's no windows showing. It's very difficult to see how to get into it. But it really looks like a fort. Now you go into it. This is where, to me, the architecture is incongruent with the code. You go inside and it's incredibly loaded with all kinds of art. It almost looks like an art gallery inside. Literally, they encourage both parishioners and people from the outside to contribute. I mean, they have fountains in there, and they have mobiles hanging from the ceiling, lots of statue stuff, and it's all this in reproductions. This is original art, and this church is very, very much about those kinds of things. They very much encourage the whole creative side of the spiritual life. Okay. Other churches, I was in another church that I noted that the building seemed to be rotting. And I brought it up to them because they were in a fairly affluent situation. Well, it turned out that they thought, the fact that I pointed it up, they really kind of liked, because they were very much about the homeless and very much about identifying with the homeless, reaching out to the homeless, serving the poor, the dispossessed, the marginalized. So the fact that they had deviated or diverted resources away from taking care of that church into these ministries was a badge of honor to them. So the fact that the place was not pristine, they thought was great. Whereas I've been in another church where the only thing they pointed to is how pretty the church was. You know, they didn't care about anything else around there. The fact that the church looked absolutely like it ought to be in a magazine someplace, they thought that was marvelous. So all these things now are starting to give you an idea of how code works. And again, it's this incredible life force that's there that is shaping behavior and shaping decisions. Okay? So if you've got a church that you're candidating for and the building's rotting down and they're happy about it, realize that's part of the code. So if you have an idea that you're going to come waltzing in there and say, you know, I want to do a capital campaign to fix up this place, you're going to get serious resistance. Serious resistance about that. Now, I'm not saying that you can't, over time, start to change that code. But initially, and if you try to do that quickly, they're going to hand you your head. I guarantee it. Because it's not aligned with their code. Now, they'll be asking you, by the way, when you're interviewing in a situation, let's say you're considering a new call, they will interview you too. One thing they're trying, they don't know that they're trying to do, and this is where interviewing becomes so nonsense as far as I'm concerned, but they're probably trying to figure out if you align with them. I'm not talking theologically. They can ask you if you believe in the virgin birth or not pretty easily, but I'm talking about these kinds of things. These non-specific, these unidentified things. How do you handle power? Are you gonna be very hierarchical with us? Are you gonna rule with an iron fist? Are you gonna be very, very laissez-faire about it? How do you handle these kinds of situations and this kind of situation and blah, 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 blah? What are the priorities in your life? All that kind of stuff. And a lot of that is, the trouble is people don't tend to think about these things. So they're not intentionally asked. So what happens in these interviews is both sides of it, you as the candidate and they as the selectors, are trying to intuit all this stuff, and they don't even usually have a clue of what they're trying to intuit. They're just trying to grope around in the dark and figure out, is this a fit, is usually what we say, which means do you align with us? But then they usually default to just, again, do you have the right seminary and degrees and the right experience, and do you believe the right things, and all these other things which are equally important to them get left behind until you get in there and you decide, okay, I heard what you said, that this is what the direction you want to go in, and you try to go in it and they kill you. Okay? Because, by the way, there's also a difference between what somebody says they want and what they need. So a selection committee may tell you what they need, left brain, logical. We really need to reach out to our surrounding community here in the homeless. But we don't want to. They don't say that to you, but that's there. And by the way, if you try to get us to do that, we will kill you. Okay? Because that's how all the resistance works. Okay? You're asking them to change their code. You're asking them to change. It brings in all that stuff we talked about change. You know, we're moving off the status quo. They're going to suffer losses as a result. So they're going to resist you in that. So do not be seduced with what they say they need, because that's all they're telling you is the right answer. You know, kingdom values tell us that we're supposed to need this, but boy, I'll tell you, I'll kill you if you try to do this. You know, and you'll find that all the way back to the New Testament churches. They're all doing the same thing. I mean, it's the way we're wired. It's the way human nature works, okay? So don't be surprised by it. Just realize it. Well, let's talk about some of the specifics that you usually think about when you think about code. The key components, and there's a slide or two on this, starting with, it says key components there. Let's talk about these, because it starts with the values, then moves to the mission, the strategy, the vision, the strategy, that all are contained within this animal we call strategic planning. Okay? So in other words, whenever hopefully you've sat in on a strategic planning, and hopefully churches are doing it more. Unfortunately, by the way, so much of strategic planning is perfunctory. People do it, but then it's kind of a nod. You know, they sort of give a head fake to it, and then they go about doing whatever they've done in the past anyway, kind of thing. But if it's done well, it is a very, very important component of a church. So, and saying this, remember, as I'm teaching you about coaching, I want you, for coachees, to really get a sense of the code that these people exist in. Okay, and one question if they're telling you they're in all kinds of distress and whatnot, there's a good chance they're misaligned with the code. Okay, now they could be red zone and a lot of other things, but it could have started with the code. In other words, they got misaligned with the code, they went red zone, and then all bets were off because we're off to the races and everybody's fighting and yelling and accusing each other and blah, 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 blah. And once that happens, again, once it's red zone, okay, all bets are off. But I would ask your coachee, let's talk about that. Starting with, what are the values of this church? What is most important to us? A value is a priority. In fact, I've always said about myself, if you want to know my real values, not the ones I tell you, remember what I tell you is left brain and logical. If I tell you the story, though, the best way to find out my values is two places. Call Bernie. Bernie has been my accountant for 30 years. And Bernie says that all tax paying and everything is a value judgment. You don't want to pay taxes? Fine. Allocate your money in different ways. Give a lot of it away. Blah, blah, blah. You'll pay less taxes. Oh, but I have to give it away. Well, okay. Taxing is set up along the lines of consumption. You don't want to pay taxes? Okay, you don't have to vote Tea Party. Just allocate your money differently. Come up with different values, different priorities in your life. Okay? So, if you want to know my values, call Bernie. He'll tell you the numbers. And then look at I used to say Daytimer, but I use now an iPhone. So look at my calendar. Where I allocate my money and where I allocate my time tells you what my true values really are. Now, when we do these valuing exercises, that's the trouble. You do a valuing exercise with the church, and usually number one is Jesus is Lord. And I'm not putting that down. All I'm saying is it's the right answer. But what the real answer might be, building a big multi-church here on this block so everybody thinks that I'm really neat as a pastor and getting done what I feel my legacy is, because my father always wanted me to be something and hated me going to the ministry. That could be the right answer, but then we're not allowed to give that. So we say Jesus is Lord, or whatever your things are. Identifying what a church's core values are, in other words, can be somewhat squishy. Unfortunately, people tend to have two sets of values. It's almost like two lists. The one is the left brain list, the conscious list, the right list. They'll talk about Jesus and all those kind of stuff and reaching the lost or the poor or whatever, kinds of things. Those are all nice. But then they have this other list. And usually, and so often, this other list is unconscious. And we call them decision-making values. So in other words, and we were talking about that, and that is, how does this church allocate its funding? Often we come up with a whole different list of values, because these are the ones we're going to use to actually make our decisions. So we have our core values that all sound good, but then we have a corresponding list of decision-making values. They should align. If they don't, you'll lack trust again, and then but so often the two lists of values do not align. And when they don't align, you will lose trust. But it also is very, very difficult for most organizations to figure out what is our core values, and do they align with the way we actually sit ourselves down and make decisions.